And I shared the same birthday. We also both build algorithms. He built an algorithm that captured all matter and reduced it down to its basic elements. And then he categorized and organized those elements in a way that made them perceptible, understandable, knowable, and useful to us. I build algorithms to capture white heteropatriarchal power. I build algorithms to capture power as its race, class, sex, and gender. I build algorithms to capture racism, sexism, classism, and all the ways in which those things are intertwined, enmeshed, and intersectional. So when I say power, I'm talking about the way in which white heteropatriarchal power takes its desires, fantasies, and agendas and materializes those things out in the real world using the vehicles of racism, sexism, and classism. So you may say, well, why? Why do you want to build an algorithm to capture power? Well, as a former federal prosecutor and now as a law school professor and also as a legal scholar, I believe you can capture, try, and correct power. You can capture it, you can arrest it, you can reduce it down to its basic elements, maneuvers, moves, and functions. And then you can subject all of those things to rigorous scrutiny, interrogation, investigation, and an actual trial, all in an effort to redistribute power and to get us much closer to our ideals involving equality, full human flourishing, and justice. So you may ask, well, how do you plan to go about building this algorithm to capture power? Well, the answer to the question how is actually a story or a parable. More specifically, the parable of the woman caught in adultery. This particular story encapsulates the basic ways in which racism, sexism, and classism operate. But the story also gives us some possibilities for liberation. So the story begins with Jesus Christ, the rabbi, the teacher, out in the world teaching. And as the rabbi is teaching, a group of Sadducees and Pharisees come up to him and say, hey, Rabbi, we caught this woman in the middle of adultery, and under Mosaic law, we must stone her to death. So let's unpack a little bit of that. The Sadducees and the Pharisees are the leaders of law and religion. They embody law and religion. They're metaphors for law and religion. I need you to hold on to that because that's going to become terribly important in just a moment. It's also important that the body they bring to the rabbi in order to oppose the death penalty, judgment, and sentencing is a vulnerable body. They bring a woman's body. It's equally important that they caught this woman in the middle of adultery, in the midst of adultery. Not in the beginning of adultery or an introduction to adultery or adultery prep or the afterglow of adultery, the results of adultery. They caught her in the midst of adultery. Now, you may say, well, why is that important and why is she harping on that? Well, one of the reasons that I teach is that I really do believe that education is one of the last forms of socioeconomic mobility. That with a little guidance, knowledge, and wisdom, you can broaden your horizon. But no matter how hard you try, no matter how hard you strive, no matter how much you work at it and put your backbone into it, you just can't commit adultery all by yourself, right? And if you don't believe me, you can go home and try this, right? And definitely go home and do that. Don't do that here in the auditorium with the cameras rolling. But you'll find that you cannot commit adultery alone, that it inherently requires at least one other person. And we know that they caught her in the middle of adultery. So there was another person there. And yet the Sadducees and Pharisees only saw fit to bring the vulnerable body to the rabbi for purposes of sentencing and judgment. Let's go back to the story. So we've got the rabbi out in the world teaching. The Sadducees and Pharisees come up and say, hey, time to impose the death penalty, woman caught in adultery, time to throw some rocks, all under Mosaic law. Well, the rabbi turns to the Sadducees and Pharisees and says, well, let those of you without sin cast the first stone. In other words, you can participate in the death penalty, sentencing, and judgment, but you have to have clean hands. The Sadducees and Pharisees give this some thought, and then they begin to leave, starting with the oldest first. The rabbi turns to the woman and says, well, where are your accusers? Hasn't anyone condemned you? And she says, no. And he says, well, neither do I. Go forth and sin no more. So this particular parable contains the basic ways in which racism, sexism, and classism operate. But it also gives us some keys to liberation. I want to focus in on three basic moves of power as they're contained in this parable. There are actually a lot more moves, but the TED people only gave me 18 minutes. So you'll have to invite me back in order to unpack the rest of this parable. But for now, the top three hits of power: obfuscation, deliberately confusing things; performance, and number three, the gaze. Obfuscation. So Foucault says that power is tolerable only on a condition that it masks a substantial part of itself. Its success is proportional to an ability to hide its own mechanisms. In other words, in order for racism, sexism, and classism to be effective, they have to render themselves invisible, imperceptible, natural, legitimate, just the way things are, inevitable, and furthermore righteous and good. And not only is power's success predicated on its ability to hide, it's also proportionate to its ability to hide. So if power can hide really well, it can do a whole lot. And then if it can't hide so well, its effectiveness is greatly diminished. Now, one of the ways in which power renders itself invisible and legitimate at the same time is it hijacks the function of law and religion in order to do its dirty work, in order to exact its agenda. And when power colludes with law and religion, the effect becomes totalizing. It becomes omnipresent, ubiquitous, everywhere. So, let's bring an example to prove the point. This is the classic case of Dred Scott, decided in 1857. It's the slavery case. And in this case, a majority of the Supreme Court justices held that anyone of African descent was not a citizen. So the majority occupied, dominated, and controlled the field of citizenry, and then relegated the bodies of anyone of African descent outside the boundary of citizenship, the protections, the rights, and entitlement. It didn't matter if you were free, it didn't matter if you were enslaved, male, female, you were outside the boundaries of citizenship. And if you're here and you don't enjoy the protections of citizenship, you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable to sexual exploitation as well as physical exploitation. So if you were someone of African descent and someone violated you sexually or physically or exploited your labor, you couldn't go to the police for help, and you couldn't go to the courts to vindicate your rights, because you didn't have any access to the courts and you didn't have any rights. And then religion kicks in and says, well, God says you ought to be a slave. And God says that slavery is good for you. And God says that slavery is good for you because slavery will save you from your criminal, evil, treacherous self. And there again, when power colludes with law and religion, the effect becomes totalizing. It becomes ubiquitous, omnipresent, everywhere. It becomes part of history and psychology, philosophy. Other examples. Undocumented workers. If you're an undocumented person and you're here and someone violates you physically or sexually, you can't go to the police or the courts without calling into question your own status. And as a result, you're vulnerable. So, another move of obfuscation in the confederacy of power. And this I call the functional equivalent of dangling a shiny ball in front of your face and stealing your wallet. And that's where power says one thing and does another. And then when you measure what power says against what it does, you get this huge discrepancy. So the Sadducees and Pharisees come up and say, we're here to enforce Mosaic law. We're here to enforce morals and ethics. A sexual perversity, a sexual transgression has occurred. We're here to fix that. And the question becomes, is that really what the Sadducees and Pharisees are there to do? Well, the answer to that question is no. And how do we know that? Because remember when we went through that little exercise and established that you can't commit adultery alone, that it inherently requires at least another person? And we know that this woman was caught in the middle of adultery, so there was at least one other person there, and yet they only saw fit to bring the vulnerable body of a woman to the rabbi for purposes of sentencing and judgment. Because what they're really interested in doing is playing and vulnerable body, controlling, dominating, and subjugating that body. Now, you religious scholars out there and you biblical scholars will say, you know what? This is the problem with legal scholars interpreting the Bible. See, little Miss Law School professor, you ought to know that in the days of biblical antiquity, only women could commit adultery. Only women could be charged with adultery. Only women could be charged with adultery and guilty of adultery. Because it's a woman-only crime. Which is why the Sadducees and the Pharisees only brought the woman. But you see, that would be my exact point. You see how power hijacks the function of law and religion in order to do its dirty work, in order to exact its agenda, which is really playing and performing on a vulnerable body. And under the auspices of law and religion, it renders itself legitimate and invisible at the same time. See, that would be my exact point. Right? Other examples of power saying one thing and doing another. In this country, we've had a war on drugs. We've reached a societal consensus that we're going to declare a war on drugs. And yet, when you look at the demographics of people who've been incarcerated as a result of the war on drugs, they're disproportionately people of color, leaving a lot of people to argue that, in fact, we didn't have a war on drugs. We had a war on vulnerable bodies of color. And then some still argue as well that we've used the criminal justice system to define crimes in ways where we turn those vulnerable bodies into property again. Another example of power saying one thing and doing another. And in this particular case, it's maybe a little closer. And this is our houses of worship. Sometimes you may hear a scathing criticism leveled against homosexuals. That homosexuals are going to cause the end of the earth, the great apocalypse, the end of days. How homosexuals are directly responsible for all natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes. How homosexuals are the greatest sexual perversion and travesty in history. Now, the question becomes, is that scathing criticism really interested in sexual perversity and sexual violence? Perhaps not, because if we're really interested in sexual violence, it would turn all of that energy and ire and anger on all of that sexual violence that occurs under the roofs of our homes and in our intimate spaces, which is where a lot of sexual violence occurs. And that, in fact, that kind of scathing criticism is really interested in playing and performing on a vulnerable body, which gets us to our next move of power, performance. Anthony Farley, a law school professor, suggests that racism is a compulsion that performs as pleasure. That racism, sexism, and classism are all compulsions that perform as pleasure. That we do ourselves a tremendous disservice when we oversimplify racism, sexism, and classism. And one of the ways in which we oversimplify power is when we reduce it down to hatred or animus only. That in fact these things are far more complex than that. That in fact these things embed themselves inside our minds. They saturate every layer of our brain, even that layer of fantasy. Because what the Sadducees and Pharisees really want the rabbi to do is to join with them in a fraternity and to engage in a figurative gang rape of this woman that serves the same function as a lynching. That the stoning, gang rapes, and lynchings are all performances. And what they perform is who's powerful and who's vulnerable. Who's deserving of pain and who's deserving of pleasure. Who's good and who's evil. Who's deserving of life and who's deserving of death. Who's deserving of being judged and who gets to do the judging. Which brings us to our third move of power, the gaze. So, implicit bias research teaches us that the moment we see a black or brown body, we immediately associate that body with dangerousness, suspiciousness, and the need to be controlled. And we do it instantaneously, automatically. We do it so quickly because we're convicted about it. It does not require some sort of deliberate, conscious cogitation. And then when we see a white body, we immediately associate that body with goodness, innocence, and righteousness. And again, it happens instantaneously. It happens so quickly that these associations actually become lodged and entrenched inside our minds. They become architectural structures anchored inside our brain. They become a frame through which we see the world. They become a filter through which we see evidence. They become the judgment that we cast before we've seen the body of proof. And these things, these associations are so fixated on our minds that they affect the way we see things, such that when we see a black or brown body engaged in actually innocent conduct, we create narratives of dangerousness, suspiciousness, pathology, criminality, and treachery. And then when we see white bodies actually engaged in mischief, mayhem, and criminality, we create narratives of innocence. Because you see, when that body goes to the store to get some candy, and how much more childlike can it be than for a child to go to the store and get some candy? But when that body goes to the store to get some candy, the narrative that gets created is one of dangerousness, suspiciousness, the need to be controlled, and the need to be put down. Because you see, this body is never entitled to innocence and never entitled to childhood. And yet, when this body freely admits that it's engaged in sexually predatory behavior and sexual violence, we create narratives of innocence. It's just locker room talk. Boys will be boys. Men will be men. This is natural, and furthermore, it's kind of good because it's so manly, right? So some other examples of the gaze of pathology and the gaze of overvalorization. Battered women. Battered women come forward and they say, I've been battered. And immediately we start asking, well, did you fight back? Why did you stay? Why did you go? Right? Because we keep that gaze of pathology fixated on that vulnerable body. We engage in all of that victim blaming. And we know from Foucault that power operates at the level of distraction. Because when we stay fixated on that vulnerable body, we never get around to asking the accused, why do you hit women? Rape victims. Rape victims come forward and they say, I've been violated. And immediately we start asking questions like, isn't that shirt too tight? And isn't that skirt too short? And why were you out there? And why were you out there so late? And why were you drinking? And why did you pass out drunk? And why did you wait so long to bring these accusations? Because there again, we keep problematizing and pathologizing that vulnerable body, and then we never get around to the accused. But part of the beauty of the woman caught in adultery is that the rabbi takes that pathological gaze off of the vulnerable body of that woman and shines it on the sources of power, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Because when the rabbi asks, let those of you without sin cast the first stone, the rabbi also initiates the very first phase in the cycle of liberation. And this is a calling for all of us, where we critically reflect on our thoughts, where we interrogate our minds candidly, and we ask where racism, sexism, and classism have embedded themselves inside our minds. And make no mistake about it, if you're talking about implicit bias, whether it's race, class, sex, or gender, doesn't matter, we're not just talking about thoughts. These thoughts lead to actions, where we play and perform on vulnerable bodies, from microaggressions to macroaggressions. So we must be as suspect about our actions as we are about our thoughts. And then within the parable, everybody has agency. So the oppressor, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, have the agency to critically reflect on their thoughts and actions. And if those things are not clean, if they don't measure up against full human flourishing, they have the agency to refrain from imposing the death penalty, to refrain from imposing any kind of adverse action that's tainted by power. And then within the parable, there's a redistribution of power. There's a redistribution of agency that creates a much more democratized space that gets us much closer to our ideals of full human flourishing. And then full human flourishing becomes the standard by which we measure our thoughts, our actions, our ability to find agency, and our efforts to redistribute power. So, there's absolutely nothing new about state violence and police power playing and performing on vulnerable bodies. There's absolutely nothing new about state violence and police power playing on vulnerable bodies of color, because state violence and police power have played on vulnerable bodies of color in this country since the beginning of this country. State violence and police power have been playing and performing on vulnerable bodies since the days of biblical antiquity. And we don't need to look any further than the woman caught in adultery to make that point. But what is new is all of the agency that technology gives you. Technology gives you the agency of your cell phones, where you can record and document and bear witness to these killings. But then technology gives you more. You can upload these images on your social media spaces, Facebook, your blogospheres. And when you do, you can begin to draw similarities and symmetries between these cases. And then you begin to realize that we're not just dealing with aberrant conduct in the South, or the North, or the East, or the West. That in fact, what we're dealing with is something that is systemic, something that is an epidemic, if not pandemic. But technology gives us more, because on our blogospheres, we can engage in a national discourse, a new narrative, and political activism, where we take that pathological gaze off the lives of these people, and we shine them on the sources of power, like, for example, law enforcement and the law. And we can begin to ask questions and problematize. Like, for example, we can ask how the grand jury process was so manipulated as to sanitize and legitimize the deaths of Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, and Eric Gardner, just to name a few. But then we go further, because technology also gives us the ability to engage in that national discourse, that new narrative, where we can recognize the humanity of these people. So, in closing, I'm going to end pretty much where we began, because you see this picture kind of looks like a periodic table. You see, we can take power and we can distill it down to its basic elements, moves, maneuvers, and functions. And we can subject those things to scrutiny, interrogation, investigation, all in an effort to redistribute power in a way that gets us much closer to our ideals involving full human flourishing, much like the woman caught in adultery. Thank you.